Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's webinar. It's all about feedback this afternoon, and thank you to our presenter, Bianka Malecka, for presenting. I just want to tell you a little bit about Bianka. She currently teaches a direct entry programs course at UNSW Global in Sydney, and she's a PhD student at the Centre for Research in Assessment and Digital Learning at Deakin University, Melbourne. I know Bianka from when she took part in the English Australia Action Research Program in 2015, and in that year she was awarded highly commended on the program for her project on exploring the effects of e-portfolios on students' writing. So thank you for coming to present this afternoon, Bianka.
Thank you, Sophie, and hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. As Sophie said, I teach at UNSW Global, a direct entry program called UEEC, University English Entry Course, and I will be referring to this program during my presentation today. So our programs run for 20, 15 or 10 weeks. So if you hear UEEC 20, that means that this is a 20-week course. I would be happy to answer any questions that you have. So if you do have any questions, please type them in. And Sophie will convey them at the end of the presentation where we have discussion session. My contact details will be there at the end of the presentation. So if we can't discuss something today, please feel free to email me. So as Sophie said, it's all about feedback today. And I would like to start today by talking about the models of good feedback practice and then touch upon common problems with feedback. I would then like to report back on the action research that I undertook in 2017 with UEC 20 and 15 students to find the preferred mode of feedback to written tasks. And finally, I will explain the concept of backfeed and talk about how it can have the potential to increase student engagement with feedback. I will also give examples of tasks that can encourage backfeed in the classroom. So feedback is a contentious and slightly confusing issue for researchers, teachers, but also students. And there are many models of good feedback practice and effective feedback design, which position either teachers or learners as the drivers of feedback. And today I would like to briefly discuss two of those models. I would also like to note that when I am referring to feedback today, I am thinking about formative feedback, which is a key aspect to assessment for learning. So the first model is the one proposed by Hattie and Timperley, in which effective feedback addresses three main issues. The first one is feed up, and feed up enables learners to ask questions about goals. So when students understand the ultimate goal, they are more likely to focus on the learning tasks. But establishing a purpose is also crucial because when teachers have a clear overall purpose, they can align various assessments, they can plan their tasks more appropriately. So for example, when it is clear that the purpose of a particular unit, and I will use an example from my course, is to write a synthesis essay, then students know what to expect and the teachers can plan readings or investigations and different collaborative projects to ensure that students focus on content that is related to this goal. The second element is feedback, and obviously the individual teachers' individual responses to students' work are perhaps the most recognized component of a good feedback practice. These responses should directly relate to the learning goal, which was established in the feed up phase. So the best feedback provides students with information about their progress or lack of progress, but it also gives them suggestions what they can do to come closer to the expected, to come closer to reach that goal or to the expected standards. So for to use an example of the synthesis essay, effective feedback would explain to students what elements they have done successfully and what they still need to work on. So they perhaps may have developed their paragraphs very well, they're coherent, and it's easy to follow the supporting ideas, but perhaps their paraphrasing is still problematic. So it is important to point these elements in that phase. And the last phase is feed forward, and this formative aspect of feedback is quite often left out because it demands, first of all, some sort of flexibility in lesson preparation and lesson planning, and very often we don't have that much flexibility, but it also demands a thorough knowledge and understanding of the whole course. So as you see here, it answers questions, the feed forward answers questions about where students need to go next. So if the majority of students had problems with paraphrasing when preparing for the synthesis essay, teachers should modify the lesson in order to address that. But that's just one element of feed forward. Feed forward also relates to the idea of sustainable practice. So the idea that feedback should be forward-looking, not just backward-looking. So it should focus on aspects of the work which can be relevant for later assessments. So, for example, in the synthesis essay, students write a synthesis essay during their writing classes, but we also want to show them that the skills of paraphrasing would be relevant in the research presentation that they will give later in the course. So they need to see that skill can be transferred to a different lesson, so from writing to speaking, and to other to later tasks in the course as well. Now, the second model of good feedback practice comes from the article by Molloy and Boud, Rethinking Models of Feedback for Learning. And the authors write about the evolution of feedback design and propose 3 models of feedback. And I would like to briefly talk about these 3 models now. So the first model is what they label feedback mark 0, which gives hopefully useful information to the learners. It is given or done to receivers, so it is teachers giving feedback to students, and it is provided on completion of work. So the Molloy and Boud hope that this feedback is a thing of the past, that it's no longer practiced. I have to say that when I think of my experience at university, which was now a while back, and also my high school, this was the feedback that I would receive, which in a way someone could say is really lack of feedback, because it doesn't have much impact on future work and doesn't allow the student to make any changes, to act upon it. So feedback mark 0 is hopefully no longer practiced. Then there is feedback mark 1, which, as you can see, gives now more than hopefully useful information. And it is still given or done to receivers, but the main difference is that it is given in time to allow for improved work. So this is providing feedback, formative feedback on drafts or assessments. And the researchers claim that, Molloy, the authors claim that this is the feedback that's practiced most commonly in higher education. And this is the model to which we should strive. So this is feedback mark 2, which encompasses all the elements of feedback mark 1. But the main difference is that now it is dialogic. So now it's not only done by a teacher, it's not only provided by the teacher, but it's also provided by others. So peers, it is also self-feedback or self-review. So the students are actively involved in the feedback. So it's no longer this one-way communication, but it's more the transmission of information between two agents. And according to Molloy and Boud, this can lead to the development of evaluative judgment. And evaluative judgment is that ability or capacity to make decision about the quality of one's work. So without having to rely on external, on experts, on others, but having that inherent knowledge of whether what I produce is good or wrong. So this, if you are interested in finding more about it, I would encourage you to visit this website because it has quite a lot of interesting insights into current feedback practice. So feedback for learning is a collaboration between Monash, Deakin and Melbourne universities, and it aims to answer questions about effective feedback practices in higher education. I think that some of those can be translated and can be applied in our ESL setting. So for especially thinking about direct entry courses, as our students would, of course, that they are on the direct pathway to universities. So if you are interested to read more, there's an interesting selection of case studies, for example, about the use of authentic feedback through social media or personalized feedback at scale. So I do encourage you to look this up. But even though we have those models of feedback practice and we know that we need to strive to feedback mark 2, for example, there are still common problems with feedback. And I guess that's why I'm talking today, and that's why you have tuned in to listen, because we know that there are issues with feedback. And one of those issues is the problem of shared meaning. So even if students and teachers acknowledge that there is a problem with feedback, it doesn't mean that they interpret it in the same way as each other. So they can have actually quite different perceptions of what feedback involves. I guess very often teachers believe that what we do is we constantly give feedback, whereas students think that they never receive enough of it, or students don't see feedback as multidimensional to their learning as do teachers. But I guess the second problem here, the problem of impact on learning, is something that is particularly interesting to me, because at the end of the day, the ultimate test of feedback is whether it enhances learning, whether it makes a difference to what students produce. And perhaps it doesn't really matter whether what mode of feedback we use. Some of us can use correction codes, others can use explicit criteria and so on, as long as it makes a difference to learning. But the research shows that quite often it doesn't. And it then becomes what Sadler calls dangling data. So the feedback which is not used is basically meaningless. So it is quite important to actually make sure that students will act on feedback, because it will then eventually impact their learning. And the last problem here that relates to teachers believe that marking is a chore, and I think marking is probably one of the most talked about topics in staff rooms. and a lot of teachers might feel that, or some teachers might feel that it is done mostly to generate grades or to justify grades. They can have perhaps low expectations that feedback can in fact improve student performance. So in a way, making feedback satisfying both for teachers and students is quite important. And there are also more technical, I guess, if I may say, issues with feedback. Sometimes it is too general. Sometimes students do not understand the language that we use. Perhaps they don't understand the correction code very well. Perhaps there is inadequate guidance as to what they can do next. So there's not enough feed forward or not enough advice on what aspect of the feedback they should focus on. So all this means that quite often students become disengaged, and that in a way can slow their learning. And today I came across this quote, which I think is very valid, and especially it definitely relates to the photo that I took a few years ago. So let me just read it to you. We know that some students pay no attention to feedback and put it in the bin, while others would read it and then put it in the bin. So I guess for me, not allowing it to land in the bin in the first place, even once, if they've read it, we might think it's a success, but at the end of the day, it still ends in the bin. So not allowing it to land in the bin was why I did the Action Research project in 2017. So my intention was to find out the preferred mode of feedback to written tasks. And I worked with UEEC 20 and 15 students, and I held interviews with writing teachers, with students, and students responded to survey questions that were posted on Moodle. And I would like to just give you a little bit of background into my work as a writing teacher, what we call the writing teacher. So in the UEEC 10, so a 10-week course, our students are expected to write that many tasks, and that is times 18, because this is the average number of students in the classroom. So it ends up being that many words, and a writing teacher needs to produce around 200 feedback reports. So that's a lot of work, and for me it was actually quite important to find out whether what I am giving to my students is what they value and what they want to receive. And as I've mentioned, I've interviewed the teachers to find out about what kind of feedback, in what ways rather, we give feedback to our students, and I would like to share those with you now. So the first way are the consultations. These are one-on-one consultations that happen fortnightly, and this is when we sit down with the student and analyze the piece of writing together. So it's very much a synchronous dialogic task where students have a clear voice, and this is when students do satisfaction surveys at the end of the course. This is what they often see as the most valuable feedback. Obviously, I am aware of limitations of resources, and we are actually quite lucky to be able to have those consultations. The second type of feedback is delivered during writing workshop classes, and writing workshop is a weekly 2-hour class in which students analyze their peers' writing. We encourage peer feedback in that lesson, so students would look at the assessment criteria and focus on a particular aspect that was taught or that was relevant to a particular task. So, for example, it could be paraphrasing. This is very much a group session that students, in which students actively participate as well. We encourage students to rewrite their tasks, and they rewrite them on different platforms. So this is Moodle. Some of them would use Wiki, or they would rewrite by hand. They are still practicing timed writing for the exam, so there is a little bit of writing on paper going on as still. They can use Padlet, so some teachers use Padlet. Some teachers use Google Docs for marking or for giving feedback. There's also the criteria, the writing practice evaluation criteria, and a few of us have also experimented with audio feedback. So I guess we are doing quite a lot. There seems to be a variety of different feedback modes that to a large extent depend or are directed by the needs of a class, but also what the teacher feels comfortable with. So in order to find out a response to my research question, I collected the responses from 77 students, and I'm not going to talk about all the questions today, but I would just like to mention one that is particularly relevant for this webinar. So what is students' most valuable essay feedback? How they want the teachers to give them feedback. And if you look at the findings here, you will notice that the majority of students would want teachers to correct their errors or to underline their errors, and fewer appreciate correction code or the evaluation sheet. So I have to say that I was surprised by these results, but it's not a bad thing, I guess, to be surprised by the results. That's the beauty of action research in a way, that you can come across findings that are completely different to what you expected, and then you can go to places, which I guess happened in my case, because I started thinking, why is there this discrepancy between what we know is good for students and what they want? And there are many answers. The students might that may relate to perhaps their educational background, perhaps to their low self-esteem, maybe those technical issues that I mentioned earlier, misunderstanding the comments, misunderstanding the correction code. There are also some socio-cultural factors that can be involved. But when I thought about my own group of students, I kind of ruled these ones out, and I thought that perhaps the reason why they are not they don't appreciate those comments or correction codes is because they don't have an opportunity to be involved, so the opportunity to be engaged with feedback. So as you can see here, we need to find ways to help students make good use of the hard work we put into giving them feedback. So we do acknowledge that feedback can be a burden for us, but we need to make sure that students, that handing in that assessment or that feedback sheet with a correction code is not the end of the cycle, but it is the start of a new activity or of a new cycle, which really takes moves students into active learners. And this is how I arrived at backfeed. So backfeed is a process in which learners analyze the meaning of feedback and organize their own reflection in a systematic form. So backfeed involves teachers' formulation of tasks which are specific to feedback analysis and students' active involvement in those tasks. So the idea is to show correlation between students' work and teachers' comments, to alert students to their deficiencies and gaps in their work, to engage them in more critical thinking, and which is beneficial in learning transfer. So there are many ways to encourage backfeed. The main thing is really to involve students in actively doing something with the feedback. So before that feedback sheet lands in the bin, we need to make sure that there is something, that there is a task the students are required to do, that feedback sheet would be relevant for the next stage, for that feed forward, if you will. So embedding dialogue in feedback, promoting self and peer feedback are quite well-known strategies. I would like to mention a few activities that I created for my students that perhaps you will find valuable as well. So, as I've mentioned, I mentioned our consultations or one-on-one sessions with the students. And I have to say that those sessions are quite demanding for the teacher, just because it's a very intensive session where those 15 minutes spent with the student first of all, they happen. There's never enough time to say everything, but also we want to really convey quite a lot in those sessions. And I always had a feeling that I was never sure how much of this actually sinks in. So student would listen, would sit next to me and listen and nod, and then after 15 minutes they would take a seat. Someone else would come back, and I kind of thought that I need to make students a bit more accountable. I am conveying this information to them. I want to see, in a way, evidence, if you will, that they are taking it on board. So that's how the idea of the consultation log came up, to as we are analyzing the work, to fill in that log, talk about the problem areas, allow students to take the log home, think about what action they can take in order to address those areas, and perhaps if they have any questions, come back the following week with those questions. So the students seem to enjoy using that log. Here is one quote from my UC20 student. And so did teachers. A few of them decided to give it a go, and I'll give you a minute to read this comment here from one of our teachers. And we've also talked about changing that log, and a colleague of mine suggested including also strengths in that consultation log, which of course is a very relevant suggestion, because it can empower students and raise their self-esteem. So and this is evolving. This log is, you know, can be, you can add columns to it, you can delete some columns. So as long as it is relevant to the learners, and as long as it makes a difference. Now, another task I would like to talk about are revision memos. And just to give you a little bit of background why I arrived at that task, I have often noted that students who consistently redraft their weekly writing show improvement in their writing. I've assumed that there is some sort of improvement, but I've never expected any sort of self-reflection, but merely asked for reworked drafts. And I guess you may have noticed it in your context as well, that the draft sometimes would have the same errors, exactly the same errors as the original work. And that frequency of the same errors in a way led me to question the effectiveness of just rewriting. I mean, I know it's very, I'm putting it in quite simplistic terms here, but the reason is because I want to stress that that recurrence of errors, or one explanation could be that perhaps they didn't read that feedback, so that acting on feedback, the problem of feedback having impact on learning that I mentioned before, perhaps this is why they haven't actually engaged with it, and that's why they are making those errors again. So that's when I thought the revision memos could be handy, because revision memos are the documents that writers complete after they revise a piece of writing. So they encourage students to reflect, to make more thoughtful choices, but also to recognize that their papers improve in the process. So assigning those before submitting the draft is an attempt to help students look more critically at their work, but also to recognize some of their strengths and weaknesses. They can be very simple, as you can see here in the example. So one or two sentences. So the student here says, my first essay wasn't the best as I forgot to include essay outline. My supporting ideas was unclear and I had no examples. This draft improves essay outline and I tried to include 2 examples to explain my position. So even if there are some other problems with this particular draft, I can see that the student read my feedback and that they made an effort to act upon it by making those revisions. So that can be a good tool, and I guess perhaps a good pattern of behavior that they might perhaps use later at university. Elective feedback means that students can request particular feedback, request feedback on a particular aspect of their work. And I think elective feedback can be practiced with, especially with direct entry students or academic English. So with students on higher levels, they obviously need to have a more understanding of the structure of a particular written work. And elective feedback might help to reduce unnecessary comments, but it also in a way makes students more active in that process. So they direct what they want the teachers to focus on. So in this particular example, a student wants to get feedback on grammar, and the same task, another student would like to have feedback on the supporting ideas. So in a way that can reduce perhaps the marking load to some extent. I don't think that elective feedback should be practiced regularly, but I see the value of including it throughout the course. And another task, which is feedback comparison, that requires students to complete some sort of a self-review. Of course, we by asking students to complete such a self-review, we are expected to have explained the criteria to them, so they can't respond to criteria if they don't understand them. So it is important to go through those during the lessons and analyze exemplars and so on. So our students regularly work with assessment criteria through peer review and during writing workshop sessions that I mentioned to you. There can be some criticism of self-review. I do acknowledge that feedback generated by students may be of low quality, and perhaps that criteria might just be ticked off without much thinking, and perhaps this is an example that you see here. The student just goes yes, yes, yes. But this is in a way to take feedback as monologue. That perspective of feedback marks 0 or 1, but we know that it is important to combine different sources of feedback. So giving students an opportunity to compare or for multiple comparisons. So it could be self-review, it could be peer review, and could be a teacher review as well, gives them an opportunity to reflect. So it is quite valuable to see perhaps the gaps, or it can be also quite empowering if students think that they didn't do something well, but the teachers prove them wrong. So, for example, they might think that they didn't incorporate enough evidence, and the teacher might actually say that this is and that is not the case, that the evidence was good. So it can be quite empowering as well. And as in most direct entry programs, students write a lot. They write on a weekly basis. So they can compose portfolios, and tracking progress is a possibility. So the students can be encouraged to perhaps look back at the argument essay that they wrote in week 2 and compare it to the argument essay in week 8. So they would need to look at the feedback that they received in for those particular essays and perhaps reflect on their growth. So that is something that can be quite beneficial. So in the same way as we are teaching academic literacy or information literacy, feedback literacy should also be taught. And there are 4 features of feedback literacy, which is understood as the ability to read, interpret, and use written feedback. And this probably is could be a topic of some other webinar. There's no time to go through all those features, but I would just like to place backfeed in that context that larger context of feedback literacy. And I see it as somewhere between making judgment and taking action. So students develop capacities to make academic judgment, for example, through feedback comparison or through composing revision memos. They have to reflect whether they've incorporated the feedback, if so, how. But they also need to be aware that they need to take action in response to that feedback. So they need to fill in the consultation log. They have to think about the questions. They need to compose a revision memo so that eventually they will have their own repertoire of strategies to act on feedback. And I guess technology has an important role in supporting feedback literacy, backfeed practices, because it allows students to archive and access their feedback. I think that the tasks that I mentioned today, the backfeed tasks, are relatively easy to implement. They do not require excessive teachers' input. However, as with all diagnostic tasks, it is advisable to monitor the student engagement, so learning analytics would come quite handy. So I hope that I have inspired you to reflect on your feedback practice and persuaded you to some extent that backfeed is important. If you decide to use any of the activities I've mentioned, or if you create any of your own activities, please let me know. I'd be very interested to find out. And let's keep those bins empty. Thank you.
Thanks, Bianca. Okay, so now we have an opportunity for discussion or any questions for Bianca. So if you do have any questions or anything you'd like to say, please type it into the chat box. There are already some questions that have come through, so I'll just read them out now.
Maybe I'll just move the slides to my contact details so that they are displayed.
Sure.
Now.
Yep. Oh, someone was asking about the references as well in the question, so they will be available. So we'll share the recording and the slides from this session in an email to everybody tomorrow, and there's Bianca's contact details. Okay, so somebody said that they liked the idea of a consultation log and that they're going to try and implement it. Someone else has said that it seems intuitive that students who engage with feedback, both through fixing problems and commenting on the feedback itself, would be better served than those who only use it to fix problems. I wonder if there's any research to support this.
Yeah, I think that's a valid comment. The research into student engagement on feedback is very clear as to saying that those students that act upon it are more successful. However, there's also some information about the fact that sometimes perhaps less specific and individualized feedback can force students to actively engage with the information to be more productive. So in other words, it doesn't always mean that the more feedback we give, the better they will act upon it. Sometimes it is just that feedback that is more, I guess, directed, and the feedback that can be implemented in stages, that is quite valuable.
Okay. Somebody said that they're really interested in audio feedback. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So I did mention that a few of the teachers at our center tried audio feedback. I don't know much. I haven't actually read much about the impact on learning gain. I can just relate what my colleagues mentioned to me. So definitely students embrace that form of feedback, and they've noticed that the amount of feedback that they get more feedback once it is recorded than they do when it is written. And so that also relates to the teacher's perspective, that they perhaps it's a bit more burdensome. It also depends on how convenient, comfortable you are with technology. I think one of the teachers was using a very simple, just the iPhone camera, and had the written work in front of him, and basically recorded that session. But there's I guess that the screencast and different ways that you can do that. So I think it is from what I've heard and from what I've read, students do appreciate it, but my colleagues gave up on it precisely because it was too burdensome. So if anyone has any experience in audio feedback, would be great to hear.
Yeah, I've just shared a comment that somebody made about using Audacity for audio feedback. So hopefully everybody can see that comment as well. Great, thank you. We have another question. What advice do you have for programs with wordy feedback rubrics?
Well, I guess that's a hard one because this is something where teachers, I guess, don't have as much flexibility. So this is something that they are, I understand that those wordy feedback rubrics are imposed on, and the teachers are expected to write comments in those rubrics. I guess what I would do is I would try to highlight one or two of the comments from each particular rubric and ask students to act upon those. This idea of getting too much feedback is present in some literature that I've read, that students can be overwhelmed by the amount of comments and by the number of comments, and that can be sometimes an inhibition for them. So I can understand that this can be a requirement, but perhaps what I would do is just highlight or write in the comments, choose a few of those and ask students to act upon them in the next task.
Okay, great advice. Thank you. All right, well, that's the end of the questions. Bianca, is there anything else you'd like to say?
No, I think I would like to encourage you to give students a voice in the feedback process. I think we very often focus on how to give best feedback. So there are quite a lot of sessions at conferences about the most effective feedback practice, whether that's rubrics, whether that's criteria and correction code, and that is very important. But I think I would like to encourage you to make students a bit more active in that feedback process. In the same way as we talk about the dialogue, the importance of dialogue in all aspects of learning, I think it shouldn't be overlooked when we talk about feedback.
Yeah, okay, great. All right, so someone's just said that they totally agree with this. Promoting the student voice is about putting the students at the centre of the process, which is where they should be, rather than us at the centre all the time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'd like to thank you, Bianca, for today's presentation. It was a really useful journey through the ins and outs of feedback, and it was extremely interesting to hear your suggestions for backfeed tasks. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thanks to everybody for attending.